All right, so welcome to the first chapter in or for the summer session. Um, so with this first chapter, we're just really going to go over kind of the basic foundations for environmental science. So what we're looking at, how we define, say, in the environment, and then what are kind of the things that interact with the environment and take a toll on the environment that comes from, say, humans and human interactions, and kind of how we affect the environment. So this is going to first chapter is going to kind of be just a broad overview of this material, and then as we go throughout the summer session, or as we go throughout the session, whichever session you're in, um, we'll continue to go into these in more detail, and kind of explain and elaborate on a lot of these things. All right. So an outline, we're just going to look at the nature of environmental science. We're going to define this and discuss it, and then we're going to talk about emerging global issues related to the environment. So environmental science, what exactly is environmental science? Environmental science is a field that is highly interdisciplinary. And what that means is that it includes, information, theory, techniques, experts from all different sorts of fields, and brings that information together to kind of look at one, or to study one aspect. And in terms of environmental science, we're using not only scientific fields, but we're also using social fields, financial fields, fields from law, from ethics. And so environmental science is just an interesting field because it's so interdisciplinary in that, you know, we're using aspects of biology, ecology, chemistry, physics, and combining that with a social aspect, so like economics, sociology, etc., and using it to make decisions on how we should treat the environment, what kind of, you know, things we should do to the environment, and looking at kind of the impacts that are going to kind of happen to the environment based on decisions and effects that we kind of put in the environment itself. And we'll talk about why that's important because um, in the natural world, everything is interrelated. So any kind of thing you do may not seem like it will have big consequences, but it will have some consequences, and most of the times those are much larger than what you would expect. Um, and when we say environmental science, right, so we're studying the environment and our impacts on it. Well, first we have to define the environment. So in order to practice environmental science, we have to know exactly what the environment is. Well, the environment is everything that can affect an organism during its lifetime. And now that can be biological, so it could be other organisms, other living things. It could be non-living aspects of the environment, such as temperature, precipitation, so kind of any aspect of climate. It could be the soil. It could be nutrient cycles. It could be erosion, etc. And so the living factors that affect these organisms are called the biotic factors. The non-living factors, such as climate, soils, those are abiotic factors. So when we say everything that affects an organism during its lifetime, we're meaning any kind of living interactions and any kind of non-living interactions is included in the environment. So the environment of that organism. And like I mentioned earlier, interrelatedness is a big concept in ecology and environmental science and pretty much your kind of natural sciences. Because whenever we study living organisms, or I shouldn't say natural, I should say like biological sciences, because when we're studying living organisms, any kind of change that you make in a system um, has this kind of cascading effect. And so everything is pretty much interrelated in communities and ecosystems and the environment. And so interrelatedness is a big concept in environmental science. And just to kind of give you an example, there's this famous study that's been looked at, and it really was a natural experiment that kind of wasn't planned to happen the way that it did. Basically, um, Yellowstone National Park used to have wolves in its borders before people eradicated wolves from Yellowstone. Um, and so that really changed the dynamic of that ecosystem. So, for example, elk populations, which you can see, let me get my pointer. So, so this individual here, elk populations got to be fairly large. And as you get larger elk populations, because the wolves are no longer feeding on the elk, your willow populations decrease. And that affects a lot of other um, organisms and animals that depend on those willows as habitat and food sources. And so there's kind of this negative cascade effect in terms of the other populations whenever the wolves were taken away from Yellowstone. But now in the mid 90s, there was an introduction of 31 wolves, and that 31 wolf population has now grown to about 100 individuals. And the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone kind of counteracted those cascading changes that occurred whenever the wolves were removed. So basically, what you have is actually a healthier ecosystem. So the wolves being reintroduced fed on the elk, which dropped their population levels. And then because they had lower population levels, the willows increase because they're not being fed on by the elk as much. Then you have beavers increase because they now have the willows and the environment that they need, the resources that they need. And then when your beavers increase, you get more beaver ponds. And then with beaver ponds, you get more wetland environments. You get, waterfowl. You get, um, wetland plants. You get other wetland organisms that only can live in those wetland habitats. And so by having wolves present, you have a healthier ecosystem because of these downstream effects. Whenever the wolves were removed, the beaver population decreased because of decrease in willow population, which was a result of elk population increase. And so everything is really connected in environments and in ecosystems. And so you really can't just do one thing, right? So what that means is that you can't just say remove an elk population and affect that to be the only consequences, the elk populate or the wolf population. You can't remove a wolf population and expect that wolf population, the removal of that population to really be the only consequence. So you think, okay, well, now they're not preying on the elk as much, so the elk will have higher numbers. It doesn't stop there, right, as we just saw. And so that's with everything and anything pretty much in the natural world and ecosystems and so even the environment, right? So if you release more carbon dioxide, it's going to have downstream effects. So we're not just we're not just doing one thing, we're kind of having this domino effect. And John Muir, famous naturalist, said truly Yellowstone National Park is a story that illustrates a point that he made. And so he said, tug on anything at all, and you'll find it connected to everything else in the universe. And so this really is the case whenever we're looking at environments and ecosystems. And so that's what we're going to kind of bring into this class is that we're going to talk about this interrelatedness theme. And this interrelatedness theme doesn't just hold true to the animals and the plants, but there's also a human component to it as well, um, because there's human dominated effects that involves philosophical dilemmas, economic dilemmas, political factors. And so you have to think, even though the wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone, there was some difficulties on getting that to happen, and it did not make everybody happy. So, who do you think might oppose wolf reintroduction and why? Right? So just kind of take a minute, pause the video, and think about that. Why would somebody not want the wolves to be reintroduced if it leads to a healthier ecosystem? Okay. So, I mean, you probably would have thought maybe ranchers. Uh, Ranchers have cattle, they have sheep. Wolves will prey on those cattle and those sheep, and it affects their livelihood. And so there has to be some sort of incentive for those ranchers to want to live near wolves and not kill those wolves and not prevent them from coming onto their property and consuming their livestock. And so ways that we kind of get around this is through like economic and political um, you know interactions where maybe if a rancher loses a cattle to a wolf, the state reimburses that rancher so that they're not losing their livelihood, which is money that comes from that livestock. But we're also able to keep wolves in the ecosystem and maintain a healthy ecosystem because we get resources from these ecosystems, right? If we don't have healthy ecosystems, we also don't have access to those resources because those ecosystems aren't functioning as appropriately and as efficiently as they could and should. And so that's a big component as to, why we want these healthy ecosystems and why we want to help and educate people on why something like wolf reintroductions is actually a good thing and we should support it. And so we use this approach in environmental science called the ecosystem approach. And the ecosystem is basically, another term almost for environment, where it's um, the region in which the organisms and physical environment are interacting together, right? So you have your biotic components, your living components, and your abiotic components living and interacting together, okay? And so for an environmental scientist, they really need to recognize and understand the interactions that take place in an environment, in an ecosystem, and they need to integrate these natural interactions with the uses humans need to make of the natural world. So, like I mentioned, we gather resources from ecosystems. We use a lot of things that the natural world provides for us, but by removing or changing that environment, we're having these downstream effects that could be detrimental depending on the circumstances and the situation. And so that leads to these political and economic issues where environmental problems that come up don't necessarily coincide with, human made boundaries, right? So we go in and we say, okay, this is a boundary we're going to draw over this piece of land. Now, just because that boundary exists doesn't mean that nature follows that boundary. So, for example, air pollution generated in China can affect the air quality of the Western Hemisphere, of Europe, of Canada, of Russia. And then vice versa. Air pollution generated, say, in the Western Hemisphere can affect neighboring cities, but it also could affect the Eastern Hemisphere. And so, even though we have these political boundaries defined, particles, particulate matter in the atmosphere doesn't say, oh, I was generated in the United States. I have to stay in the United States boundaries. It's not the way it works. And so we have these political and economic issues that come up because you have one country or one place that is producing a lot of pollution that's affecting the rest of the world or neighboring cities. You end up with kind of a slippery slope as to, that's causing diseases, that's causing bad water, and so you end up with these political and economic issues that could potentially involve law, and can lead to bad things happening. And so we have these emerging global issues that are coming about because of the way we have these artificial boundaries and the way humans use and take resources. And so we practice a lot of things in terms of resource gathering at a non-sustainable rate. And usually we don't realize it until that resource has been depleted or has started to collapse. But we do have the ability to make development, resource use, sustainable. And it is possible, but it becomes increasingly difficult because of the amount of humans that are on the globe. Um, Population growth is, exponentially increasing every day. We have more and more people on the globe. Most of this increase is in your underdeveloped countries, your poor countries. Um, and what that means is that when you have more population growth in areas that don't have access to good resources to begin with, that puts even more pressure on those resources and leads to activities that will cause environmental degradation even more. And so you get this cycle of poverty that happens. And so, if somebody's poor, they're going to do whatever they need to do to feed their family. So if that means they have to fish in an area that should not be fished in because that fishery is collapsing, they're not really going to care as long as they can get a fish to feed their family, right? Or they may harvest animals to sell their materials. And, if that animal is endangered or threatened, you know, if you're poor, you're more worried about your family than you are probably an animal. And so that in turn means that environmental degradation is going to happen because they're using resources that are already famished and leading to negative consequences. And so by continuing to harvest that resource, they're going to kind of stay in that cycle of poverty. And so it's really important to maintain functional ecosystems. And this isn't just from like a, you know, environmental outlook or, tree hugging, whatever you want to call it, movement. It really comes from the fact that if you have a healthy, functional ecosystem, you're going to get more out of that ecosystem in terms of resources than if it's a degraded ecosystem that is not functioning appropriately and that is basically dying, right? And so when we look at the globe's ecosystems, much of the Earth's surface has been converted for agricultural use. Now, what you get when you convert land to ag, even though that land is, yielding a lot of crops, the biodiversity loss, so the amount of animals, plants, and the functional diversity, so the functions that those animals and plants and bacteria and microbes provide has been lost. And it's very hard to get that functioning ecosystem back once it has been removed, because you have to think that ecosystem probably evolved and kind of worked to get to where it was at over, tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And whenever you lose the functions in those ecosystems, it does have economic consequences. So, for example, if you know, remove a field of flowers, then you're probably negatively affecting bees. And as a farmer, you rely on those bees to pollinate your almond orchards. And if you're in the Central Valley, you've ever driven through the Central Valley, you know that you see bee boxes out in almond fields and other orchards, and that's because the bees need to be there to pollinate so they can get their crop. But yet we're destroying land that could naturally have bees on them. And so we're essentially losing that resource and having to find a way to generate that resource for ourselves. There's also this issue of food security. So the poor of the world rely on the food they grow to feed their families. So they have this kind of larger connection to the land, basically. Um, and whenever you have floods or disease outbreaks in their food sources, whether it's livestock or plants, you get a lack of food. And then so you get a lack of malnutrition. If you're malnourished, you have, lower immune systems. And so that could lead to more and more deaths. And again, this kind of cycle where those poor populations just can't get out of that. And so whenever we look at kind of sustainable development, we really need to look at environmental governance as kind of one of the ways to initiate this. So overall, progress towards sustainable development has been slow. Like I mentioned, we generally overharvest our resources, and it's not until we see these consequences happening that we begin to change in terms of that resource use. But what we need to do is to try to get ahead of that. And so but one of the issues is that we often ignore strategies that are useful to maintain an ecosystem and a sustainable ecosystem, I should say. So these long-term ecosystems that remain functional and remain healthy. And so a lot of our developmental strategies just kind of ignore strategies that lead to those type of healthy ecosystems. Um, and so, for example, regulation of salmon in the Northwest actually involves the governance of several states and Canada. So, for example, British Columbia. And so all of those states have to work together in order to maintain a healthy salmon fishing population. And if we don't, practice sustainable methods, then that salmon population, that salmon fishery can and would collapse. We also have to look at air pollution, right? Air pollution is a big issue. Like we mentioned, it travels all around the globe. And, we have to look at kind of what emissions we release and start trying to get away from that. Um, the emissions we release and the runoff that happens from our fertilizers and our sewage plants, our livestock industries, it runs into our water source. And if you don't have clean and healthy water, you're not going to be able to survive. Um, and so looking at environmental governance to reduce this is a big issue we need to look at. And so, for example, malaria still is a big contributor to deaths around the globe. Over 400,000 deaths to malaria that we could look at, which is a result of how we affect or use our environments. Accidents in home, workplace, traffic, we're looking at about 5 million deaths. Cancer, coronary heart disease, due to lifestyles, due to things we put in the environment, 25 million deaths. And then we have emerging diseases that are coming from organisms that are able to live in environments because of environmental changes that we've caused and that we've actually um, caused basically a chain reaction for these organisms and diseases to enter into new environments and new ecosystems. And all of these directly affect humans, right? And so we're not looking at environments and environmental sustainability only at the organisms that live in that environment in terms of animals, plants, microbes, fungi, etc. But humans, again, rely on these healthy environments. And so when those environments go and those environments change, we're directly affected by that. And so having good environmental governance leads to good environmental security. And if you have environmental security, then you have these stable and reliable resources that we can access to, that we can have access to. And what happens though is that whenever you know, begin to lose access to a certain resource, you get conflict and social instability, right? If I told you that water was going to be gone by tomorrow, panic would break out. You know, everybody would run to the stores to try to get water. Unless you had a well on your property, then you would begin probably stockpiling water. It could lead to conflict. There's been people say, where our next war is going to be over water. And so water is this really big resource that we affect and we actually control. And so, if you don't have water security, then that could lead to big issues, big issues. Um, and so here you have, examples of water where you have sea level rise actually going into a water source on the left hand side. Bottom right side, we've got sewage contaminated water. Can't even swim because there's, it's so contaminated that it could cause disease and affect humans, much less affect the organisms that are living there. And then, you know, climate change leading to more wildfires, which we see firsthand in the state of California. And so, really big issue in terms of environment security and the way we need to and should look at things. Another issue with environmental security is the increase of globalization. So, the globalization of trade, being able to move goods across the globe pretty much instantaneously, right? It seems instantaneously. Now we know cargo ships have to sail across the seas and planes have to bring them from country to country, right? So it's not instantaneously, but we can get things very quickly compared to the distance that they have to travel. But now that trade has led to the spread of exotic species. So one prime example is a zebra mussel. This image shows a structure that has zebra mussels growing all over it. And so when a zebra mussel gets into an aquatic environment, if there's no natural predators, then that zebra mussel will overtake everything. Um, and this has been a big problem in North America. And the way the zebra mussels got over, we think, is through the ballast water of ships, cargo ships. So basically, what happens is whenever before a ship, leaves port, it will fill its kind of lower tanks, the ballast, with water. And this kind of helps the ship set a little lower in the water so it floats better because those are big ships, right? But whenever they come into port before they dock, they have to release that ballast water. Now that water, say, was taken from the Mediterranean Sea or somewhere else and stored in that ship, and it had all the little fish and microorganisms that were in that water. And then when they release it in the port, all of those things are released in the new area that they're docking. And so you can get the exchange of exotic species that way. And we believe that's how zebra mussels came into North America. But, there's examples of exotic species being released through things like the pet trade and, exotic fish that people don't want. They put in the lakes and ponds and release them, or pets. So like Florida has a big issue with constrictors that are not native there, but it's warm there, lots of food, so they do well. And so there you have these really big impacts that these exotic species have on ecosystems and the environment. And so one thing that has been done is we have these conferences and conventions where people try to initiate these sustainable actions. So, for example, in 1997, you have 125 nations to meet in Kyoto, Japan. This was the third conference on climate change, and the Kyoto Protocol was developed, and it's viewed as one of the most important steps to date in terms of environmental protection and international diplomacy, especially on the issue of climate change. And so you basically have these countries saying that, okay, we're going to try to reduce emissions by this set point over the next so many years so that we can kind of curb climate change through the greenhouse gas effect. And so the Kyoto Protocol was really big in kind of looking at that. Now, so what we see then is the world facing basically two threats: inadequate and insecure supplies of resources at affordable prices, and then the environment being damaged due to the overconsumption of these resources. So not only energy, but other resources as well. And so we have some resources that are just not enough, too expensive. And we have other resources that we're losing because we're damaging the environment due to overconsumption. We also have global increases in carbon dioxide emissions due to fossil fuel use. And so that's leading to, climate changing and warming happening at a much faster rate than ever before. And the need to basically curb our energy demand in combination of increasing fuel supply diversity, so different types of fuels, and mitigate climate destabilizing emissions. So we really need to look at this idea of climate. And I just want to note that climate change is not the issue. Climate change is normal. It's happened all throughout Earth's history. We've had warm periods, we've had cold periods, but the rate at which the climate is changing is the issue. So over the past, we've had, climate change of 4 degrees, 6 degrees Celsius, which is what we expect over the next 100 years or so. Now, if that's happened in the past, you're probably saying, why is that the issue now? Um, One, that warming will lead to sea level rise, and it will cause coastlines to change and cities to be flooded, and which will cause downstream effects and all of that stuff, right? So it's kind of the natural changes that could be a problem. Um, but then there is also this issue of the rate of change. So I just said that we would expect like a 4 degree to 6 degrees Celsius change over 100 years. Now, in the past, that 4 to 6 degrees Celsius change most of the time happened over tens to thousands of years. So when you average out that degree change over thousands of years compared to 100 years, that rate of change is very drastic. So now species and environments can actually migrate with their favorable climates over long distances because they only need to migrate like a tenth of a kilometer a year to keep up with those temperature changes. But if you're changing 6 degrees, 4 degrees Celsius over 100 years, now those species and animals and plants and other organisms have to migrate, say, 5 kilometers per year or 20 kilometers per year, depending on their area and how fast that environment's changing. And not many species can migrate that fast. And plants definitely can't migrate that fast. You can't have a plant migrating 20 kilometers per year. Um, and so the rate of change is one of the big issues for climate change, right? So it's not that the climate's changing. That's a natural, phenomenon. It happens. It's how fast it's happened, and we're causing that rapid warming to happen that quickly. And so that's just kind of a little thing on climate change, right? And so 10 things we can do to help protect our environment. One is try to reduce your overall economic or carbon footprint, ecological footprint. We'll do a little discussion exercise on that where you all will look at your ecological footprint via an app and see kind of where you can lower your footprint. So some of the things you could do is reduce driving, save electricity, recycle, conserve water, make sure you dispose of any house waste safely and to guidelines. Eat local food because that means energy wasn't used to bring that food in. So no carbon emissions, or I wouldn't say no, but there's a lower carbon emission from locally processed food or locally gathered food compared to food that's imported. Donate your reusable items, buy in bulk, read your product labels, make sure what's in them, where they're coming from, and then just become informed. Knowing is such a strong factor that just by being informed on these type of issues can just mean the world of difference to the everyday citizen. And so that's what this class is going to really do is it's going to hopefully inform you about the environment and things we can do to kind of look at the environment and make better decisions on how to use resources and treat those resources. Okay. And so here's a summary page that I'll just leave up at the end of every video, every chapter for you guys to review. So these will always show the overall key points. So this isn't everything you should know. There are also all of the details we talked about, but this gives you just a good summary overview for that chapter for that day. Okay. And so with that, that's the end of chapter 1. And so by now you should have went through your introduction module and the chapter 1 material for your first module. And yeah, so let me know if you have any questions, any concerns. You can contact me through email, or you can always post questions in the discussion forum. And so with that, we'll see you in the next module.